In June of 1973, Murray Wilson died of a heart attack at the age of 55. Dennis and Brian could not bring themselves to attend the funeral. Brian told a reporter, "It's making a man out of me."
Brian loved him, yet he didn't like him. I'm not going to use the word hate because I know he didn't hate him. He loved him, but his father was very frustrating.
Brian expressed suicidal thoughts and threatened to drive his Rolls Royce off the end of the Santa Monica Pier. Mostly, he retreated into his own world.
Who knew those kind of inner conflicts? You know, so it would just be easier to tune out and to be a recluse or to make people think that you were crazy.
He picks up the tiniest vibrations of negativity and it magnifies itself within him. So from a survival point of view, it's been safer to stay inside.
Brian Wilson would spend most of the next 3 years in bed. For 2.5 years, Brian Wilson stayed in bed, trying to hide from the voices that haunted him.
He'd have a turntable next to his bed, and he would play that song, "Be My Baby." And he would play it maybe 100 times a day.
Brian heard Phil Spector's voice. He heard his father Murray's voice. His appetite for food and drugs became endless.
Did you ever try sleeping with one eye open? I mean, that's basically the way I had to sleep each night, wondering what he was doing, what he was up to, who was going to come in the house, who he was going to give money to, who was going to give him drugs.
Brian had moved into the chauffeur's quarters above the garage, where he spent many days locked inside. Those around Brian attributed his problems to substance abuse, not mental illness.
20 or 30 years ago, mental illness was like, oh boy, we can't talk about that. But you can bet your bottom dollar, had he had cancer, they would have shot him up to UCLA real quick.
Marilyn was left raising their 2 daughters on her own.
He was emotionally unavailable. He had too much on his plate. He was not available for his children.
I think one of the only times we ever sat down to have dinner, Mom served steaks, and we sat down, and she forgot to give him a fork. And so he said, "Mary, will you get me a fork?" She went to get him a fork. By the time she walked back in, the steak was gone, and he was already playing the piano. It was like...
During Brian's retreat, the Beach Boys released no new material. In July of 1974, Capitol Records put out a greatest hits album that shot to #1. Concert audiences swelled. Everyone wanted a new record. The only thing missing was Brian. Over the years, Brian had visited more than 20 therapists. In late 1975, Marilyn sought a more dramatic course of action. Psychologist Eugene Landy was a shrink to the stars, having worked with clients such as Rod Steiger and Alice Cooper. He had also been a consultant on the original Bob Newhart show. He called his unconventional approach milieu therapy.
And Dr. Landy, you know, had a full-time staff at the house 24 hours a day, which turned out to be a nightmare for my children and me. But we did it because we did it for Brian. I mean, we'd do anything for him to help him.
Landy worked at getting Brian off drugs and on a diet. He bullied him, explaining, "There's only room for one crazy person in Brian's head, and that's me." Landy forced Brian out of bed, and within months rushed him back into the studio to record with the Beach Boys.
Back in time with just a rhythm and rhyme, Gregorian chants were a real big thing.
An album and TV special spearheaded the first Brian is Back campaign.
He was back, you know, to a certain extent of as much as they could push him to be back.
I don't know. I sort of got put in the limelight for a while. I was under the lamp, so to speak, We're singing that same song, still singing that same song.
It was good business, but again, some in the band resented the attention lavished on Brian.
So Brian is that resident genius and teacher, leader harmonically and musically. And the reason I think he's gotten so screwed up at times in the past is because he is that sensitive.
The TV special featured a scene in which Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi forced Brian to go surfing. It was filmed on his 34th birthday.
We're from the Highway Patrol, Surf Squad. Surfing? I don't want to go surfing. Now look, you guys, I'm not going. You get your hair wet, you get sand in your shoes. Okay, I'm not going. Come on, Brian. Let's go surfing now.
Everybody's learning how. Come on a safari with us. Come on.
Let's go. All right. Okay, let's go. Let's go surfing.
Let's go surfing now. Everybody's learning how. Come on.
Brian was petrified of climbing into the water until his full-time therapist wrote on a small piece of paper, "You will not drown. You will live." Signed, Dr. Landy. Brian kept the note in his bathrobe pocket. In November 1976, Brian made his first talk show appearance.
I did my dose of LSD. It shattered my mind, and I, came back, thank God, in I don't know how many pieces.
What made you come back, Brian?
That's a hard question. I probably came back out of will. Just my name is Wilson. Maybe that's where I got the will.
You were in bed for over 3 years, weren't you?
Oh, 2.5, 3 years. I hibernated. It's like some kind of a Maharishi in the hills, hiding in his bed, snorting cocaine, meditating. Okay. Thank you.
In 1 year, Dr. Landy's bill had grown to $20,000 a month. Marilyn fired him.
Right back, right after this.
As new Beach Boys material floundered, the band started to market its past.
A lot of anything with the Beach Boys always comes with a certain amount of baggage, and for me as a fan, it's always been trying to rip away the baggage and just get down to the core music.
Lawyers, drugs, and money kept the band on the brink of breaking up. They toured on separate planes. Band members entered the stage from opposite sides, so they never had to speak to one another.
Got into a fight.
The group dragged Brian back on the road. "A performing circus bear," said one friend.
It made it a little difficult, because sometimes he would be playing something other than what we were playing.
CBS Records offered the Beach Boys a deal with the condition that Brian Wilson co-write 70% of the material. He cried tears of frustration as he signed the contract. Although he had full-time handlers, Brian slipped back into drug use and overeating. He often ran away from home on binges. Private detectives once found him playing for free drinks in a San Diego piano bar.
He said, "I want to feel what it's like to be a bum, like on the streets and all that." You don't think that was hard to deal with? The final straw was he was so out of it, he didn't know what he was doing anymore. And when Carney was a young girl, he had offered her a drug. And I said, "That's it? Nothing in the world, no matter how much I loved that man, nothing was going to hurt my children, and no one." That was it.
On September 15th, 1978, Brian and Marilyn were legally separated. He spent several months hospitalized for drug dependency. For the next 15 years, Brian would rarely see his daughters. The Wilson brothers tried to help, but each was going through a divorce and battling personal demons.
Brian, along with his two brothers, came from the same dysfunctional family. For the other two brothers to be more functional on an emotional level, in my opinion, would be impossible.
Carl played the caretaker, trying to keep the family and the band together.
People don't know what Carl did for Brian. They don't